There is a date that mainstream history does not want to sit with for too long. 65,000 years, say it slowly. 65,000 years of continuous human civilization, not migration, not wandering, not primitive survival at the edge of a hostile landscape. Civilization, agriculture, engineering, astronomy, aquaculture. Trade networks spanning 3,000 kilometers. Surgical bone tools, astronomically aligned stone structures built before the first Egyptian pharaoh drew breath, before the wheel, before writing, before every single thing we were told was the beginning of human achievement. And it happened here, in Australia. Not in Mesopotamia, not along the Nile, not in the Fertile Crescent between two rivers where history books told us the story of humanity began. Right here. On this ancient red continent, on the oldest exposed rock on the planet, beside lake beds that have been dry for 12,000 years, inside caves where the ochre is still bright after 40,000 years, a civilization existed and flourished and built things and remembered things and passed things down with such precision that the knowledge is still here today, still intact, still being spoken, still being practiced. And you have probably never heard most of it. Not because the evidence is thin, the evidence is extraordinary. Not because the researchers have not done the work. The work has been done and it keeps being done, and every year another excavation, another genetic study, another astronomical analysis, another piece of stone technology pulls the timeline back even further and makes the story even larger than it was before. You have not heard most of it because of something much simpler and much more deliberate than a gap in the research. You have not heard most of it because someone decided you should not. Sit with that for a moment. When British colonizers arrived on the Australian continent in 1788, they made a legal and philosophical declaration that shaped everything that followed. They called the land terra nullius, a Latin phrase. It means land belonging to no one. Empty land, unoccupied land. Land without people, without law, without civilization, without history. That declaration was not a mistake. It was not ignorance, it was a choice, and it was a choice with consequences. Because if you declare that the people already living somewhere do not legally or philosophically exist, then you also erase everything those people built, everything they knew, everything they were. You do not have to excavate it or study it or understand it. You simply look past it and it becomes invisible. For nearly 2 centuries, Australian archaeology operated under that shadow. Not because every archaeologist was complicit or dishonest. Many were genuinely curious, genuinely dedicated. But the framework they worked inside had already decided what they would and would not find. The framework said these people were primitive. The framework said they had no fixed settlements. The framework said they were hunter-gatherers in the most basic sense, moving and never building, never accumulating, never developing the complexity we associate with civilization. The framework said this before anyone had looked very carefully. And then people started looking, and what they found was not what the framework had predicted. What they found was a civilization so old, so technically sophisticated, so astronomically aware, so architecturally intentional, so genetically complex, so linguistically layered that it does not fit inside any comfortable category that Western archaeology had prepared for it. It does not fit because those categories were built around a timeline that places the dawn of civilization at roughly 5,000 years ago in the Middle East, with writing and bronze and grain storage and city walls. It does not fit because this civilization was doing extraordinary things when that timeline had not even started yet. This is the story they left behind. This is the story of what was here before the pyramids, before the pharaohs, before Mesopotamia, before everything we were told came first. And this is the story of how it was nearly erased and why it was not, and why the evidence keeps coming back, and why no amount of institutional inertia or colonial legacy can hold back what the ground keeps giving up. There are 20 chapters in this story. Some of them will make you rethink a timeline you have been carrying since you were old enough to sit in a classroom. Some of them will make you quietly furious. Some of them will make you feel something that is harder to name, something that sits between awe and grief, the feeling you get when something very old and very beautiful turns out to have been there all along, waiting for you to finally stop and look. Get comfortable, let your shoulders drop, this is going to take a while, and it is worth every minute. Number 1, the discovery that rewrote everything. In 1969, a geologist named Jim Bowler was doing fieldwork on the western shore of a dry lake bed in New South Wales. The lake was called Lake Mungo. It sat inside a crescent of ancient sand dunes called the Walls of China, formations that had been shaped by wind and time into ridges and hollows that looked, in the right light, like something from another planet entirely. Bowler was not looking for ancient human remains. He was mapping the geological layers of the dunes, tracking how the landscape had changed over tens of thousands of years as the lake filled and dried and filled again. He was doing the quiet, methodical work of a geologist who has learned to read stone the way other people read books. And then he found something that was not geological, Eroding out of the dune, exposed by the same wind that had been sculpting those ridges for millennia, were human bones, fragile, ancient, stained by the sediments they had been lying in for a time that was not yet measurable by any instrument Bowler had with him that day. He documented what he found. He reported it through the appropriate channels. And within a relatively short period of time, the remains were recovered and taken for analysis, and the analysis produced a date that stopped the scientific conversation in its tracks. The remains were approximately 42,000 years old. In 1969, that date was already extraordinary. It pushed the known timeline of human presence in Australia back far beyond what had been assumed. But the story did not stop there, and it did not stop in 1969. Because Lake Mungo had more to give. Over the following years and decades, additional remains were found at the site. More analysis was done. Improved dating techniques were applied as the technology advanced, and the date kept moving. In 2003, a comprehensive study of the sediment layers and the associated remains produced new findings that suggested human presence at Lake Mungo, going back as far as 68,000 years in some interpretations of the data. But here is what the date alone does not capture. Here is what tends to get lost when the number gets all the attention. The people at Lake Mungo were not simply present. They were not merely surviving. The remains that Bowler found in 1969 belonged to a young woman. She had been cremated. Her bones had been carefully gathered after cremation and deliberately broken, and then the fragments had been arranged and buried in a prepared grave. This is a funerary ritual. This is ceremony. This is a community that had developed specific practices around death, specific beliefs about what should happen to a person's body when their life ended, specific people who knew how to perform the ritual correctly, and passed that knowledge to the next generation, the oldest known cremation in the world, on the shore of a dry lake in western New South Wales, 42,000 years ago. And there was more. A second set of remains found at Lake Mungo, known as Marree Man, showed evidence of deliberate burial with the body placed in a specific position, with ochre, the red iron oxide pigment used in ceremony and art, applied to the remains, ochre preparation and ritual application, at 42,000 years old minimum. When researchers began to sit with the full picture of what Lake Mungo contained, the implications were difficult to overstate. This was not evidence of primitive survival. This was evidence of complex spiritual life, evidence of ceremony, evidence of community practices sophisticated enough to require specific knowledge passed deliberately from one generation to the next, evidence of people who thought about death and what came after it, and who took action to honor those beliefs in physical ways that they expected to last. And this was not an isolated site. Lake Mungo was one window into something much larger, much older, much more complex than anyone had been prepared to acknowledge. It was the first clear crack in the framework. It was the discovery that made every other discovery in this story possible. Because once you accept that human civilization at that depth of time looked like this, you have to ask what else you've been missing. The answer, it turns out, is quite a lot. Number 2, 65,000 years. What that number actually means. In 2017, a team of researchers published a paper in the journal Nature that sent a quiet shockwave through the archaeological community. The paper was the result of years of excavation at a rock shelter in the Northern Territory, called Budj Bim. The site had been known for decades. It had been excavated before. But this time, the team used a combination of dating techniques, including optically stimulated luminescence dating of individual sand grains, that produced a result more precise and more convincing than anything the site had yielded before. The date they arrived at was 65,000 years. Human occupation of Australia, confirmed by stone tools, grinding stones, ochre, and reflective substances used in art and ceremony, 65,000 years ago. This was not a marginal result. It was not one outlier reading from one dodgy sample. It was a robust, multi-method conclusion backed by the recovery of more than 11,000 artifacts from the lowest layers of the deposit, including edge-ground hatchet heads that are the oldest known ground-edge axes anywhere on Earth, 65,000 years. Walk through what that means in context. The Great Pyramid of Giza was built approximately 4,500 years ago. Stonehenge in its final form is roughly 3,500 to 4,000 years old. The earliest writing systems emerged around 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. The agricultural revolution, the shift from nomadic hunting and gathering to settled farming that most historical frameworks treat as the foundation of civilization, began around 12,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent. The oldest known temple complex, Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, which astonished the world when its dates were confirmed, is approximately 12,000 years old. Every single one of those benchmarks, every single date that Western historical frameworks have used to mark the beginning of human complexity, falls inside the last 12,000 years. The civilization that existed in Australia was doing complex, intentional, ceremonially sophisticated things 53,000 years before any of that. When you hold that number at its actual scale, the timeline that most of us were taught in school does not just look incomplete. It looks like a small room inside a very large house that nobody told you existed. The room is real. The things inside it happened. But it is one room, and the house goes back much further, and the oldest rooms are the ones in Australia, and they are furnished with things we are only beginning to understand. Now, here's the part that tends to produce discomfort in establishment archaeology, because the question that follows from 65,000 years of continuous habitation is not a simple one. It is not, were people here? They were clearly here. The question is, what were they doing and how complex was it? And how do we account for the full scope of what a civilization that old would develop across that span of time? Think about it this way. Modern civilization, the version that began with the agricultural revolution, has been running for roughly 12,000 years. In 12,000 years, we went from stone tools to smartphones, from the first cities to global networks, from chipped flint to nuclear physics. 12,000 years produced everything you can see from where you are sitting right now. The civilization that existed in Australia had 65,000 years to develop. Not 12,000, not 20,000, 65,000, more than 5 times the span of time that produced the entire modern world. And the argument that has been made implicitly and sometimes explicitly in mainstream Western archaeology is that nothing of comparable complexity emerged. That 65,000 years of continuous habitation produced, essentially, the same stone tools at the end that existed at the beginning, and not much else. That a span of time 5 times longer than our own entire recorded history somehow yielded less development than a few centuries of industrialization. Pause and ask yourself whether that claim requires more evidence than we have been given, or less. The researchers who have actually spent time with the material, the archaeologists who have worked the sites and read the genetics and listened to the knowledge holders and analyzed the astronomical alignments, do not say nothing emerged. They say the opposite. They say something emerged that is different from the development path Western civilization took, that operates by different principles, that stores knowledge in different forms, that builds differently, organizes differently, relates to landscape differently. They say the civilization that existed here for 65,000 years was not less than Western civilization. It was different from it, and the difference has been mistaken for absence for 200 years. The mistake is correctable. The correction has begun, and the evidence for what actually existed here is more substantial, more detailed, and more surprising than most people have been told. Number 3, the stone house builders of Victoria. Somewhere around 30 years ago, a set of stone structures in the Western District of Victoria were formally surveyed and documented by archaeologists in a way that produced results most of the discipline was not prepared for. The structures were in a place called Budj Bim, which sits in the volcanic landscape around what is now known as Lake Mungo. The landscape there is striking in a way that stays with you. Dark basalt rock formations, wetlands threading through a terrain shaped by ancient volcanic flows. The kind of country that looks like it has been arranged with intention, because a very significant part of it has been. What the surveys found at Budj Bim were stone walls, hundreds of meters of them. Not naturally occurring formations, not random accumulations of rock. Deliberately constructed, precisely positioned stone walls forming channels and weirs and enclosures across the wetland landscape. And when archaeologists began to date what they were looking at, the dates they got back were not in the range of centuries. They were in the range of millennia. The stone aquaculture system at Budj Bim is now confirmed to be at least 6,600 years old. 6,600 years. That places it older than Stonehenge, older than the construction of the Great Pyramid, older than the beginning of most of what the Western world considers the ancient world. The Budj Bim eel traps and stone channels were engineering an aquaculture system for harvesting, storing, and smoking short-finned eels more than a millennium before the first pharaoh was crowned. And the system works. That is the part that tends to produce a long silence in people who hear about it for the first time. It is not a ruin. It is not the remains of something that functioned once and then failed. It is a functional aquaculture system that continued to be used by the Gonditjmara people, whose ancestors built it for thousands of years, and portions of which could be made operational again today. The scale of it is significant. The full extent of the stone channel system at Budj Bim covers approximately 150 kilometers. 150 kilometers of engineered stone waterways designed to capture eels moving through the wetlands, channel them into holding areas, and allow for selective harvesting that would not deplete the population. This is not a fish trap. This is not an improvised technique. This is a managed aquaculture system operating at an industrial scale, designed by people who understood the behavior of the eels, the hydrology of the wetland, and the engineering principles required to turn a volcanic landscape into a productive food system. But even that is not the full picture of what Budj Bim represents, because alongside the aquaculture infrastructure, Archaeologists found something else: stone structures, permanent, intentionally constructed stone buildings. Not temporary shelters, not camps, but actual residential architecture. The Gunditj Marree people were not nomadic at Budj Bim. They were settled. They were living in permanent stone houses, in a permanent community organized around the management and production of a reliable, large-scale food source. This is the definition of civilization. This is what we say distinguishes civilizations from hunter-gatherer societies: permanent settlements, agriculture or aquaculture, architectural infrastructure, organized food production. And this was happening in Victoria, Australia, 6,600 years ago, using basalt stone as the primary construction material, in a landscape that had been deliberately modified for productive use. The Gunditj Marree people were not discovered doing this. They were not taught it by visitors from elsewhere. The genetic record, the oral record, the archaeological record all say the same thing. This is local development. This is what 65,000 years of continuous habitation of a landscape produces when people are paying attention to what the landscape offers them and are sophisticated enough to engineer a response to it. It was here the whole time. The stone walls were sitting in the Victorian countryside for 6,600 years. They were visible to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Number 4, the eel trap engineers and the aquaculture system older than civilization. Stay at Budj Bim a little longer, because the more you look at what the Gunditj Marree actually built here, the more it resists any easy categorization as primitive. The short-finned eel, Anguilla australis, is a remarkable animal. It hatches in the Coral Sea, somewhere in the deep ocean off Queensland, and it makes its way as a larval ribbon creature, transparent and flattened like a leaf, across hundreds of kilometers of open ocean until it finds a river mouth and begins its journey upstream. Over the course of its life, it moves through multiple habitat types, from saltwater to freshwater to brackish transition zones, and it grows. Eels at Budj Bim in the managed wetland system can live for decades. They can grow to several kilograms. And they are extraordinarily nutritious, calorie-dense, rich in protein and fat in proportions that would have supported a substantial human population. The Gunditj Marree understood all of this, not in the language of modern biology, but in the language of 6,000 years of observation and practice, which is a form of understanding that has a very long head start on any laboratory study. The system they built worked in the following way. The volcanic basalt flows of the Budj Bim landscape had already created a complex network of channels and depressions across the wetlands. The Gunditj Marree stone engineers did not ignore this natural infrastructure. They read it. They identified the natural flow lines that eels would use when water levels rose and fell with seasonal variation, and they extended and formalized those channels with stone walls, creating a network that guided eel movement in predictable directions. At key points in the network, they built weirs, stone structures that spanned the channel and allowed water to pass through small apertures while trapping eels moving upstream. At other points, they created holding ponds, enclosed areas where captured eels could be kept alive in controlled conditions, allowing for storage and selective harvesting rather than a single annual take. They also smoked the eels they harvested. Archaeological evidence at Budj Bim includes remains of smoking facilities, evidence that the Gunditj Marree were processing and preserving eel protein in a form that extended its usable life beyond immediate consumption. This is food storage, this is surplus production. This is exactly the kind of capacity that, in every other archaeological context in the world, we associate with the emergence of complex, settled societies. The UNESCO World Heritage listing that Budj Bim received in 2019 recognized it as one of the most extensive pre-colonial aquaculture systems on the planet, not in Australia, on the planet. The formal language of the World Heritage inscription notes that it demonstrates that Aboriginal Australians had developed a sophisticated semi-sedentary society based on the systematic and sustained harvesting and management of natural resources long before European contact. Semi-sedentary. The qualification is interesting because what the archaeological record at Budj Bim actually shows is something more than semi-sedentary. It shows permanent residential architecture, sustained infrastructure maintenance over thousands of years, intergenerational transmission of the technical knowledge required to operate a system of that complexity, and a community organized around the management of a reliable food surplus. That is not a qualification. That is civilization. The gap between what the evidence shows and how the evidence has been described is a gap worth noticing. It appears in the language used to discuss Aboriginal technology in society and academic contexts with a regularity that becomes, once you start looking for it, very difficult to ignore. The hedge, the qualification, the slight downshift in the vocabulary that happens whenever the evidence from an Aboriginal site would, if applied to any other culture on Earth, demand the word civilization. The stone walls at Budj Bim are still there. They have been there for 6,600 years. They are patient. They do not need us to acknowledge them to remain exactly what they are. Number 5, the ancient trade routes that crossed an entire continent. There is a particular piece of stone that keeps appearing in archaeological sites across Australia in a way that should not be possible if you accept the premise that the people who lived here were isolated, localized, and technologically static. Ochre, specifically processed ochre from sites hundreds and in some cases thousands of kilometers from where it is found. Red iron oxide pigment, ground and mixed and transported across the continent in quantities and with regularity that can only mean one thing: organized long-distance trade. But it is not only ochre. The evidence for pre-contact trade networks across the Australian continent is extensive, multi-material, and has been documented by researchers for decades in a literature that has not received the mainstream attention it deserves. Stone tools made from materials whose geological source is precisely identifiable have been found far from their origin points. The stone type tells you where it was quarried. The site where it was found tells you how far it traveled, and the distances involved are not local, they are continental. Researchers studying the distribution of stone tool materials across southeastern Australia have documented movement of specific stone types over distances of 600, 800, even over 1,000 kilometers. Not just the raw material, but finished and semi-finished tools, objects that required skill to produce, and that were traded as finished goods, not as raw materials to be worked locally. This distinction matters because it implies specialization. It implies that some communities were producers of specific goods that were then circulated through exchange networks across vast distances. Specialization and exchange at that scale is the foundation of every complex economy that has ever existed. The networks were not simple. They were organized. They followed established pathways, connected known meeting points, and operated on principles of reciprocal obligation that encoded the terms of exchange in social and ceremonial frameworks that persisted for generations. Researchers who have studied the records of early colonial observation alongside the archaeological distribution of trade goods have been able to partially reconstruct these networks, and what they reveal is a system of connectivity spanning the continent from the tropical north to the temperate south, from the eastern coast to the western deserts. Bala shells from the northern coast appear in ceremonial contexts in the far south. Pituri, a psychoactive plant preparation used in ceremony and as a trading currency of sorts, moved along specific pathways from its production areas in Queensland across the continent in quantities large enough to register in the distribution records. Pearl shells from the northwest were found in ceremonial use thousands of kilometers from the ocean in the interior of the continent. Each of these items marks a line on a map. Connect the lines and you have a network. This network was not accidental. It required knowledge of routes, of seasonal water sources, of safe passage through the territories of other groups, of the protocols governing exchange between different communities. It required relationships, established connections between groups whose territories it passed through, maintained through repeated interaction over generations. And it required institutions. Social structures capable of organizing and guaranteeing the movement of goods, and the people who carried them across a landscape where the distances between water sources could be lethal. In other words, it required exactly the kind of organizational and social infrastructure that we associate with developed civilizations in every other part of the world. There is one particular trade good whose distribution across the continent is worth sitting with for a moment. Greenstone, specifically the ground edge axes made from a fine-grained volcanic greenstone quarried at a place in Victoria called Mount William. These axes were not distributed randomly. They followed specific pathways. They appear in archaeological deposits at sites spread across a substantial portion of southeastern Australia, always with evidence of having been transported rather than locally produced. The quarry at Mount William was not simply a place where anyone could go and take what they needed. It was a managed resource. Access to it was controlled by specific groups whose social authority over the quarry was recognized across the network it supplied. This is resource management. This is controlled production and distribution. This is, again, exactly the economic infrastructure we associate with complex pre-industrial civilization everywhere else on Earth, described in exactly those terms when it appears in any other archaeological context, and described in marginally different, slightly more hedged terms when it appears in Aboriginal Australia. The trade networks were here. They were continental in scale. They operated for thousands of years. They connected communities across an entire continent in relationships of exchange, obligation, and mutual dependency that are the economic foundation of any complex society. Number 6, the sky maps nobody was supposed to find. Dwayne Hamaker is a researcher at the University of Melbourne who works at the intersection of Indigenous knowledge and astronomy. The work he has produced over the past 15 years, in collaboration with Aboriginal knowledge holders from communities across the continent, represents one of the more significant expansions of our understanding of what the civilization that existed here actually knew. What he found, documented, verified, and published is this. Aboriginal Australians developed one of the most sophisticated astronomical knowledge systems in the ancient world, and they encoded it in the landscape itself. This requires some unpacking. The standard image of ancient astronomy involves stone structures aligned to astronomical events, Stonehenge aligned to the summer solstice sunrise, the Great Pyramid aligned to Orion, Newgrange in Ireland with its famous winter solstice light shaft. These are the examples that appear in popular histories of ancient astronomy, and they are offered as evidence of sophisticated sky knowledge in those ancient cultures, alignments in stone as a form of astronomical record. Australia has them too, many of them. Stone arrangements across the continent, some of which have now been formally documented and dated, show alignments to astronomical events, solstice points, equinox points, rising and setting positions of specific stars that are too precise to be accidental. The most extensively studied example is at a place called Woordi Yuwang in Victoria, a ring of stones about 50 meters across that has been analyzed by researchers from multiple institutions and found to contain precise alignments to the setting positions of the sun at both solstices and the equinox. Woordi Yuwang is a solar calendar in stone. The people who built it knew where the sun would set on the longest day of the year, on the shortest day, and on the 2 days when day and night were equal, and they encoded that knowledge in the placement of specific stones so precisely that the alignments are measurable and verifiable by modern instruments thousands of years after construction. How old is it? Dating stone arrangements is technically challenging, but the landscape context and the associated cultural record suggests substantial antiquity. Some researchers estimate it may be as much as 11,000 years old. Others are more conservative, but even conservative estimates place it in a category that demands serious attention. And Woordi Yuwang is not the only one. Hamacher and his colleagues have documented astronomical knowledge encoded not only in stone structures, but in oral tradition, in ceremonial practice, in the names of stars in Aboriginal languages, in the methods used to navigate the continent, and in a practice with no real equivalent elsewhere in the world, the reading of the dark constellations. Most astronomical traditions around the world organize the night sky by identifying patterns in the bright stars, connecting them into shapes and stories. The constellation systems familiar to Western astronomy, the Greek and Roman constellations, work this way. You identify bright stars and draw imaginary lines between them. This is how Orion, Taurus, Scorpius, and the others were constructed. Aboriginal astronomers did something different, and in some ways more sophisticated. They identified constellations not by the bright stars, but by the dark patches, the clouds of interstellar dust that block the light of more distant stars and create dark shapes against the bright background of the Milky Way. The emu in the sky, the figure that stretches across a large section of the Milky Way and is defined entirely by dark nebulae rather than bright stars. This requires a different kind of sky reading, a more patient, more detailed, more sustained engagement with the night sky than pattern matching among bright stars. You have to have spent enormous amounts of time with the sky, over generations, to develop a tradition of reading it this way. And the dark constellations were not merely decorative, they were functional. The rising of specific dark constellations at specific times of year encoded information about the behavior of animals in the landscape below. The emu in the sky, for instance, rises in a position that correlates precisely with the season when emus are laying eggs and the eggs are accessible and harvestable on the ground. The astronomical calendar and the ecological calendar were integrated into a single system. The sky was a practical tool, updated seasonally, read by anyone with the training to read it. This is astronomy in the service of a managed landscape. This is the integration of celestial observation and ecological knowledge into a functional system that guided the food-getting behavior of an entire civilization. Number 7. The Marree Man and the giant figure that should not exist. In June 1998, a pilot flying over the remote outback of South Australia saw something from the air that stopped him. Cut into the stony desert surface of a gibber plain north of the town of Marree was an enormous figure, a human figure, a man. He held what appeared to be a throwing stick or a woomera. He was drawn with a single continuous groove cut into the surface of the earth, the groove ranging from roughly 25 to 35 centimeters wide and several centimeters deep, and the figure itself was approximately 4.5 kilometers from head to toe. 4.5 kilometers. The full figure covers an area of roughly 27 square kilometers. It is visible from the air. It is not visible from the ground in any way that reveals its shape. You cannot see what it is unless you are high enough above it to resolve the individual lines into the complete image. The Marree Man, as it came to be called, produced an immediate and sustained controversy that has not been resolved in the 26 years since its discovery. The debate has revolved around two central questions. First, who made it? Second, how old is it? The who question has never been definitively answered, and the difficulty of answering it has itself become part of the story. Official investigations in 1998 and afterward concluded that the figure was of relatively recent construction, possibly made by an anonymous individual as a kind of land art project, possibly with surveying equipment and earth-moving machinery. Some researchers were confident about this conclusion, others were not. The uncertainty was fueled by several factors. No machinery tracks were found leading to or from the site. No witnesses came forward, no one claimed responsibility despite substantial public attention and a significant reward. And some of the technical questions about how a figure of that precision and scale could be produced covertly in remote outback country with conventional modern equipment have never been fully answered to everyone's satisfaction. But it is the second question, the how old question, that connects to the larger story being told here. The style of the Marree Man figure, the proportions, the posture, the specific detail of the throwing stick, closely resembles the art style of a specific tradition documented in the rock engravings and cave paintings of central and northern Australia. A style that is ancient, a style that appears in sites dated to thousands of years before European contact. Some researchers looking at the Marree Man have noted that if it is ancient, if it is the product of Aboriginal artistic tradition, rather than a recent intervention, it would represent something with no close parallel anywhere on Earth. A geoglyph on the scale of the Nazca Lines of Peru, produced by a culture that has otherwise left relatively little in the category of monumental landscape art. The Nazca Lines, for context, are also only visible from the air and were produced without any technology that would explain how the builders resolved their ground-level work into the aerial shapes they created. The standard explanation for how they managed that is the same explanation that would apply to an Aboriginal geoglyph of comparable scale. Sophisticated ground-level surveying techniques, grid systems, rope geometry, and detailed planning executed in stages with the whole shape held in the minds of the people doing the work. Whether the Marree Man is ancient or recent, the fact that it exists at all, that a figure of that scale and precision sits in the South Australian outback and defies confident explanation, is itself a kind of evidence. Evidence that the scale of what we do not know about this landscape and what was done in it is larger than the scale of what we do know. Number 8. The Bradshaw paintings nobody can explain. In the Kimberley region of northwestern Australia, there is a body of rock art so old and so technically sophisticated that mainstream archaeology has struggled for decades to fit it into any comfortable framework. The paintings are called the Bradshaw paintings, named after a pastoralist named Joseph Bradshaw who encountered them in 1891 and wrote about them in terms that made clear he did not believe the Aboriginal people living in the region at the time could have produced them. His reasoning was transparently colonial. The paintings were too refined, too detailed, too sophisticated, therefore they must have been produced by someone else. The someone else he imagined was never specified, and the logic never withstood serious examination, but the name stuck, and the debate about the paintings continued for a long time, even after the framework that generated Bradshaw's disbelief had been discredited. The Kimberley people, who are the traditional custodians of this rock art, call them Gwion Gwion. That is the name that matters. The Gwion Gwion paintings are extraordinary. They depict human figures in elaborate ceremonial dress, with detailed headdresses, tassels, sashes, and ornamentation that implies a developed tradition of material culture, of textile production or equivalent craft in perishable materials, of ceremonial costume construction. The figures are shown in dynamic postures, in movement with a level of artistic sophistication and anatomical awareness that compares favorably with figurative art produced in much later historical periods in other parts of the world. How old are they? Direct dating of rock paintings is technically difficult. The pigment itself is hard to date reliably, but researchers have found an indirect method: wasp nests. Mud wasp nests are built over rock art surfaces, and also under them, sandwiching the art between two datable layers. The nests can be dated using carbon methods, and the dates of the nests give a minimum age for the art beneath, and a maximum age for any art above. Using this technique, researchers have obtained dates for some Gwion Gwion paintings going back approximately 17,000 years. 17,000 years. The paintings were produced at least 17,000 years ago. possibly much earlier, because 17,000 years is the minimum age established by the wasp nests, not a date of creation. What was happening in the rest of the world 17,000 years ago? The last ice age had not yet ended. The Neolithic Revolution was still 5,000 years in the future. Agriculture had not been invented anywhere. The cave paintings of Lascaux in France, produced around the same period and celebrated worldwide as one of the great achievements of early human artistic expression, date to approximately the same era and receive a great deal more mainstream cultural attention than the Guion paintings, which are in many ways technically comparable and in some ways arguably more complex. The detail in the Guion figures implies things about the culture that produced them. The elaborate headdresses and ornamentation shown in the paintings require the existence of a tradition of producing those items. You do not paint something in precise detail unless you are painting something you have seen. What the Guion painters saw were people in elaborate ceremonial dress. This means the elaborate ceremonial dress existed, which means the materials required to produce it existed, which means the craft tradition required to produce it existed. 17,000 years of art that shows us a culture with complex material production, with developed ceremonial traditions, with sophisticated artistic practice, with what can only be described as a sense of aesthetic beauty that anyone looking at these paintings today, 17,000 years after they were made, immediately recognizes and responds to. They are beautiful. They are clearly made by someone who cared about making something beautiful. That is not a primitive impulse. That is a human impulse, and it is one that was present here, expressed at this level of sophistication more than 12,000 years before Egypt built the pyramids. Number 9. What the genome says they would rather you did not notice. In 2011, a research team led by geneticist Eski Willislev published the results of a genome-wide analysis of Aboriginal Australian DNA derived from a hair sample collected in 1923. The study was the first of its kind. It produced results that the authors described carefully and that the media largely missed the full significance of. The study confirmed that Aboriginal Australians are directly descended from the first human populations to migrate out of Africa and reach Australia. This was not surprising. What was surprising, or should have been, was what the study implied about timing and about isolation. The Aboriginal Australian genome had been diverging from other human lineages for so long that the separation was measurable in ways that other population separations were not. The degree of genetic distinctiveness in the Aboriginal Australian genome implied a population that had been largely isolated and continuously present in Australia for an extraordinary length of time. But the 2011 study was only the beginning of what the genomic evidence would reveal. Subsequent studies produced findings that complicated the simple narrative of a single migration followed by isolation. Researchers found evidence in the Aboriginal Australian genome of ancient genetic contributions that were not from the main African migration that populated Eurasia. Specifically, they found traces of Denisovan DNA at levels that were higher than in any other modern human population. The Denisovans were an archaic human species, related to but distinct from Neanderthals, known from a few fragmentary remains found in a cave in Siberia. They should not, on any simple migration model, have contributed significantly to the Aboriginal Australian genome, but they did. This finding pointed to an extremely ancient mixing event, a point in the deep past where the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians encountered Denisovan populations, a meeting that must have occurred somewhere in Southeast Asia or the archipelago that preceded the current island chains before the ancestral population crossed into Australia. The timing implied by the genetic signal placed this mixing event somewhere between 60 and 80,000 years ago. 60 to 80,000 years ago, which is consistent with, and in fact slightly predates, the 65,000 year date for human arrival in Australia established by the Majid Bebe excavation. The genetics and the archaeology are telling the same story. They are saying that the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians were an extremely ancient branch of the human family tree, that they left Africa earlier than any other surviving population, that they picked up genetic material from at least one archaic human species during their migration, and that they arrived in Australia more than 60,000 years ago and have been here continuously ever since. There is another genetic finding that deserves attention. In a study published in 2016, researchers analysing the genomes of Aboriginal Australians from different regions of the continent found evidence of population structure, patterns of genetic variation within Australia, that implied ancient regional differentiation. Different populations in different parts of the continent had been relatively isolated from one another for long enough that measurable genetic differences had accumulated between them. The researchers estimated that some of these regional populations had been in their specific territories for between 25,000 and 30,000 years. 25,000 to 30,000 years of people in the same region. This is not nomadism in any conventional sense. This is continuity of habitation in specific territories over timescales that make every other claim about human attachment to specific landscapes look recent. A population that has maintained its presence in a specific territory for 30,000 years has developed a relationship with that landscape, a depth of knowledge about it, a degree of adaptation to it that is simply incomparable to anything else in human experience. The genome has been consistent every time the technology is improved and the analyses have been redone with better tools and larger sample sizes. The conclusions have moved in the same direction. Older, more isolated, more genetically distinct, more ancient. The evidence from the genome does not contradict the evidence from the archaeology. It confirms it, extends it, and adds layers of complexity that the archaeological record alone cannot provide. This civilization is not young, it is not peripheral, it is not a regional variation on a theme that started somewhere else. It is the oldest continuous civilization on the planet, and its origins are deeper in the human story than any other. Number 10. The Lake Eyre civilization and the management of an inland sea. Kaditanda, which is the name the Arabana people have always used for the lake system that colonial cartography eventually labelled Lake Eyre, is the lowest point on the Australian continent. It sits in the heart of the arid centre of the country, surrounded by salt flats and gibber plains, and for most years it is one of the driest places in Australia. A vast pale expanse of salt crust extending to the horizon in every direction, shimmering with heat, almost entirely devoid of obvious life. Almost entirely. Because the Arabana people and their ancestors have known something about Kaditanda for a very long time. The casual visitors do not immediately grasp. They have known that it is not empty. And they have known that on a geological and meteorological timescale, it is not always dry. The Lake Eyre Basin is the largest endorheic drainage system in Australia, a catchment with no outlet to the sea that covers approximately 1.2 million square kilometres. Rainfall over a huge area of the continent slowly drains toward the lowest point, which is Kaditanda. When the catchment receives sufficient rain, water flows through the channel systems toward the lake, and the lake fills. This happens irregularly, driven by large-scale weather systems, sometimes decades apart, sometimes more frequently. When it fills, the transformation is dramatic. A landscape that was dry salt flats becomes a shallow inland sea, teeming with birds, fish, and invertebrates that arrive with astonishing speed from apparently nowhere, drawn by the signal of water in a desert landscape. The Arabana people and their ancestors knew this cycle. They managed their presence in the landscape around it. They had protocols for the filling events, practices for making use of the extraordinary temporary abundance that resulted from them, and knowledge of where and how to live in the landscape between those events in ways that were sustainable over the long term. But the older story of Kaditanda is the one that the geological record preserves, because the lake has not always been periodic. There were periods in the deep past when the Australian interior received far more rainfall than it does today, and during those periods Kaditanda was permanently full. A permanent inland sea in the center of the continent, large enough in its fullest extent to have fundamentally changed the habitability of the surrounding landscape, supporting plant and animal populations that made the interior a very different place from the arid wilderness it has been for the past 12,000 years. The ancestors of the Arabana people were present in this landscape during those wetter periods. The oral traditions of the Arabana contain accounts of a time when the country was very different, when water was more abundant, when the landscape around the lake supported larger populations. These are not mythological abstractions. Researchers who have compared the content of these oral traditions with the paleoclimatic record of the lake basin have found correspondence between the traditional accounts and what the geological evidence says about when the lake was full and the landscape was productive. Oral traditions encoding accurate information about landscape conditions that existed many thousands of years ago. This is the knowledge retention capacity of a culture that has been continuously present in the same landscape for tens of thousands of years, that has developed systems for passing specific environmental knowledge across generations in a form that remains accessible and actionable indefinitely. We have no equivalent. There is no Western oral tradition that accurately encodes information about landscape conditions from 10,000 years ago. We do not have the unbroken continuity of presence in a specific landscape that would have allowed us to accumulate and maintain that kind of knowledge. But it exists here, and it is not mythology. It is ecological memory, preserved in language and ceremony across a span of time that makes every archive and library in the Western world look new. Number 11. The oldest axe ever found on Earth. In 2016, a paper published in the journal Australian Archaeology reported on the analysis of a fragment of polished stone axe found at Carpenter's Gap, an archaeological site in the Kimberley region of Western Australia. The fragment was small, roughly the size of a large coin. It was made from basalt. It showed clear evidence of grinding and polishing, the technique of producing smooth-edged stone tools by abrading them against another stone surface, rather than knapping them by percussion. And the date that came back from the sediment layer it was found in was between 46,000 and 49,000 years old. 46,000 to 49,000 years. The oldest known polished stone axe on the planet. This is a significant finding, not because axe making is intrinsically complex, but because of what it tells us about the technological trajectory of the people who made it. The transition from flake stone tools made by percussion to ground stone tools made by abrasion and polishing is generally treated in archaeological frameworks as a major technological advance, one that is associated in most regions of the world with the Neolithic period, the period of settled agriculture and permanent settlement that began roughly 12,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent. The Australian ground edge axe predates the Neolithic by more than 35,000 years. This matters because it disrupts the standard developmental narrative, the sequence from flake tools to ground tools to metal tools that archaeologists have used as a rough proxy for cultural development. That says ground stone tools come later because they require more skill and planning than flake tools. If that narrative were universally true, you would not find polished stone axes in Australia nearly 50,000 years ago. But you do. What this finding suggests is that the technological trajectory of the civilization that developed in Australia did not follow the standard Western model. It was different, earlier in some respects, later or absent in others. The people who made the Carpenter's Gap axe 48,000 years ago had developed a level of stoneworking skill that the rest of the world would not reach for another 35,000 years, and they did it in isolation from every other human population on the planet, working out for themselves what was possible with stone and patience and intelligence. That is not primitive. That is independent invention at the highest level of technical sophistication available to any human community at that time, anywhere on Earth. Number 12. The language that proves continental memory. Nicholas Evans is a linguist at the Australian National University who has spent decades studying Aboriginal Australian languages, and what his work and the work of his colleagues in this field has revealed is something that does not have a precise parallel in the linguistic study of any other part of the world. Australia has approximately 250 distinct Aboriginal languages. Most of them are unrelated to each other in the way that, say, French and Spanish are related, meaning that they are not simply dialects of a single parent language. They are genuinely distinct languages with their own grammars, their own phonology, their own deep structures. But they share something that is also present across much of the continent. They share vocabulary for stars, not just the presence of star vocabulary, which would be unremarkable. What is remarkable is that across languages that are otherwise mutually unintelligible, across languages from communities separated by thousands of kilometers, and whose ancestral populations have had limited contact for tens of thousands of years, there are correspondences in the names for specific astronomical objects that can only be explained by one thing: a shared origin in an ancient common tradition. The names for the Pleiades, for example, show cognate forms across a wide range of Australian languages, not identical forms. They have been modified by time and by the phonological evolution of individual languages in the normal way that words change over centuries. But they are recognizably related, in the same way that the words for mother in French, Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese are recognizably related. They come from the same root. They descend from the same original term in a much earlier ancestral language. Evans and his colleagues have analyzed these correspondences and estimated the approximate time depth of the shared astronomical vocabulary. The results place the shared origin of these terms at a depth that is consistent with the archaeological timeline for the peopling of Australia, roughly 50 to 60,000 years ago or more. Words for specific stars that have survived in recognizable form across 50,000 years of linguistic evolution. This is the longest documented continuity of specific vocabulary in human language history. Nothing else on Earth comes close. But the astronomical vocabulary is only one example of what the linguistic record reveals. Researchers have also found evidence in the structure and vocabulary of Australian languages that encode specific knowledge about landscape features that have not existed in their described form for thousands of years. There are Aboriginal languages that contain vocabulary specifically related to navigating coastlines, islands, and sea passages in areas that are now hundreds of kilometers inland, flooded by the sea rise that followed the end of the last ice age around 12,000 years ago. The language remembered the coast after the coast was gone. What this means is that for at least 12,000 years, people maintained in their spoken language knowledge of specific geographical features that were no longer directly accessible to them, passing the vocabulary from generation to generation in a chain of transmission so careful and so unbroken that the words survived to be documented by modern linguists, who could then match them to the submerged landscape revealed by modern seafloor mapping. This is not folk memory in the vague romantic sense. This is precise geographical encoding in linguistic form, maintained for 12,000 years, with enough fidelity that the specific features described can be identified in the modern seafloor record. You would only do this, you would only preserve this level of specific geographical detail across this length of time, if you had institutional structures capable of ensuring the accuracy of transmission, if knowledge preservation was understood as a serious collective responsibility, if there was a system. It was encoded in the Songlines. Number 13, the Songlines, the operating system of a continent. The Songlines are the most sophisticated system for encoding, storing, and transmitting knowledge across generations that any human civilization has ever developed. That is not an overstatement. It is the conclusion you arrive at when you understand what they actually are, which most people raised in Western educational traditions have never been accurately told. The conventional description of the Songlines, the one that appears in popular writing, is approximately this. They are a network of paths across the Australian landscape associated with the journeys of ancestral beings during the creation period, and they are expressed in songs that describe the journey. This description is accurate in the same way that describing the internet as a network of cables that connects computers is accurate. It is technically not wrong, and it completely misses the point. The songlines are a navigational system. Each songline is a route across the landscape, often stretching for hundreds or thousands of kilometers, and the song associated with it functions as a map. The lyrics of the song describe specific landscape features, a particular rock formation, a particular water source, a particular tree, a particular bend in a dry riverbed, in sequence. The song is sung as the walker walks, and the landscape features described in the song appear as the walker moves along the route. If you know the song, you can navigate the country. If you do not know the song, the country is opaque. This is remarkable enough as a navigational system, but it is far more than navigation. Each verse of a songline song also encodes ecological information about that section of the route. What animals are present at what time of year, what plants are edible, where water can be found, what the seasonal conditions look like. And each verse also encodes ceremonial information, what protocols apply at specific locations, what stories are associated with specific features, what obligations the traveler carries when passing through. The same song is therefore simultaneously a navigational map, an ecological field guide, a legal charter governing land use, a ceremonial protocol document, and a historical record. All encoded in a melodic sequence that a person with appropriate training can carry in their memory and deploy as they walk through the landscape. And because different sections of a songline pass through the territories of different communities, the maintenance of the network requires cooperation across community boundaries. You know your section. The community whose territory begins where yours ends knows their section. The songline is therefore a cooperative information system maintained by distributed participation, with redundancy built in because multiple people in each community know each section, and the whole is more than the sum of its parts. Now add 65,000 years of continuous use to this picture. 65,000 years of people walking these routes, singing these songs, updating the ecological information when conditions changed, maintaining the ceremonial protocols, passing the songs to the next generation with the precision required to keep the navigational information accurate. The songlines are the longest running continuous information system in human history. They predate writing by 50,000 years. They predate the internet by 65,000 years. And unlike either of those systems, they have operated continuously without hardware failure, without data loss, without a single catastrophic collapse, across a span of time that makes every other human information system look like a pilot project. The depth of knowledge encoded in the songlines is only beginning to be documented by researchers working in collaboration with knowledge holders from communities across the continent. What has been documented so far is already extraordinary. Accurate geological information about rock formations, accurate hydrological information about seasonal water sources, accurate astronomical information used for navigation, accurate ecological information about species behavior linked to seasonal and astronomical cycles, and embedded throughout all of it, accurate historical information, records of events and changes in the landscape going back thousands of years, preserved in the same mnemonic structure as the navigational and ecological content. The songlines are not mythology. They are not religion in the sense that Western culture uses that word. They are a knowledge operating system, and the civilization that built and maintained them built something that has lasted longer, carried more information, and served its users more reliably than anything any other human civilization has ever produced. Number 14. The fire management that created a continent. David Bowman is a professor of environmental change biology at the University of Tasmania, who has spent much of his career studying the relationship between fire and the Australian landscape. What his research and the growing body of work on Aboriginal fire management has established is one of the most dramatic instances of human landscape transformation in the history of the planet. The Australian landscape, as it exists today, was largely created by human fire management. That sentence requires unpacking because it is a larger claim than it might initially appear. The vegetation communities of Australia, the distribution of different plant species and ecosystems across the continent, the proportion of grassland to woodland to scrub to forest, the composition of the plant communities that support the animal communities that make up the full ecological picture of the continent, all of these are not natural in the sense of being independent of human influence. They are the product of 65,000 years of deliberate, regular, sophisticated fire management by Aboriginal people across the continent. This is not burning in the simple sense of setting fires and watching what happens. It is a complex, seasonal, geographically specific practice that applies different fire frequencies, intensities, and timing to different parts of the landscape to produce specific ecological outcomes. Low-intensity burns in grassland areas to promote the regrowth of specific food plants. Strategic burns in woodland margins to create habitat diversity that maximizes animal abundance. Mosaic burning patterns that create a patchwork of vegetation at different stages of regrowth, ensuring that food sources are available at different times of year in different areas. Corridor burns that create pathways through dense vegetation. The knowledge required to do this correctly is immense. You need to know the fire behavior of every major plant species in the landscapes you manage. You need to know how different vegetation communities respond to different fire intensities and frequencies. You need to know the seasonal conditions that determine whether a burn stays controlled or escapes. You need to understand the long-term ecological dynamics of fire-adapted landscapes well enough to plan burns years ahead of time and anticipate their consequences. This is landscape ecology at a professional level. This is what a civilization that has been paying careful attention to a specific landscape for 65,000 years knows about it. The evidence for the antiquity and effectiveness of this fire management comes from multiple sources. The charcoal record preserved in lake sediments and coastal deposits shows the patterns of burning across the continent going back tens of thousands of years. The distributions of fire-adapted plant species that depend on regular burning to reproduce and compete, match the patterns of human habitation and fire management rather than the patterns you would expect from purely natural fire regimes. The dramatic ecological changes that followed European colonization and the suppression of Aboriginal burning, changes that have been documented in detail and that include vegetation thickening, biodiversity loss, and the buildup of fuel loads that now drives the catastrophic wildfires of recent decades, are themselves evidence of the effectiveness of the management system they replaced. When Aboriginal burning was suppressed across the continent in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the landscape that had been actively managed for 65,000 years began to change. The vegetation thickened because the regular low-intensity burns that had kept it open were no longer happening. The fuel loads built up because nothing was removing the accumulated dry material. The biodiversity that had depended on the mosaic of different vegetation stages began to contract. And when fire eventually came, as it always does in Australia, it came through landscapes that had been prepared by decades of fuel accumulation to burn at catastrophic intensities. The 2019 to 2020 bushfire season in Australia burned more than 18 million hectares and killed an estimated 3 billion animals. It was described as a once-in-a-generation catastrophe. Researchers studying the fire ecology of the affected regions have consistently noted that the fuel loads that drove those fires had accumulated precisely because the long-term management practices that had kept them in check for tens of thousands of years had been disrupted by colonization. The landscape knew the difference. It spent 2 centuries telling anyone who was paying attention. Number 15. The Egyptian connection. What the evidence actually shows. Every few years, a story circulates in the fringes of the alternative history community, claiming that ancient Egyptians visited Australia and left behind carvings, hieroglyphs, artifacts. The stories vary in their specific claims. Some centre on a set of rock carvings in the Gosford area of New South Wales that some people have argued contain Egyptian hieroglyphics. Others involve claimed artifact discoveries that cannot be verified or have been actively debunked. The fringe history version of Australian prehistory tends toward this kind of dramatic external contact narrative. Someone came from somewhere sophisticated and gave the local people civilization, or at minimum left traces of their presence. It is worth spending a few minutes on why this framing is so damaging and why it is also completely unnecessary. The Gosford hieroglyphics, to take the most widely circulated example, are almost certainly modern carvings, probably produced in the 19th or early 20th century by someone with a casual interest in Egyptology and access to a reference book on hieroglyphic script. Linguists and Egyptologists who have examined them have identified multiple errors and inconsistencies that indicate a person working from a visual reference rather than a reader of actual ancient Egyptian. They do not say anything coherent in Egyptian. They are decorated with genuine-looking marks arranged in a way that someone who had not read Egyptian would think looked authentic. But here is what makes the Gosford hieroglyphics and stories like them both tiresome and revealing. They are tiresome because they distract from the actual evidence of an extraordinary civilization. They are revealing because of the implicit assumption they carry, that the evidence of sophistication found in the Australian archaeological record must have come from somewhere else, from a civilization we already recognize as sophisticated, because the people who were here could not have produced it themselves. That assumption is the colonial framework in its most naked form. It is the direct descendant of Joseph Bradshaw looking at the Gwion paintings and deciding that Aboriginal people could not have made them. It is the archaeological version of terra nullius. This land had no civilization, therefore any sign of civilization must have arrived from elsewhere. The actual evidence of connection between ancient Australia and other ancient civilizations is not found in dubious rock carvings. It is found in the genetics, in the trade route evidence, and most interestingly, in the astronomical record. There are researchers who have noted correspondences between the astronomical knowledge encoded in Aboriginal Australian sky traditions and astronomical knowledge found in ancient Mesopotamian and Egyptian records, not because of contact, but because certain astronomical observations are universal. The Pleiades are the Pleiades wherever you look at them. The solstice sun rises in a specific direction relative to any fixed point on Earth. The astronomical knowledge preserved in Aboriginal Australian tradition is sometimes strikingly consistent with ancient astronomical knowledge from other parts of the world, because they were all looking at the same sky and were all intelligent enough to notice the same patterns. The connection is not foreign civilization bringing knowledge to Australia. The connection, when it exists, is independent human intelligence arriving at similar conclusions from the same astronomical data. That is not a lesser story than the Gosford hieroglyphics. It is a much greater one. It says that the people who lived here were doing the same quality of intellectual work as the people who built the great observatories and developed the astronomical traditions of the ancient Middle East, independently, simultaneously, with no contact required. That is the story that the actual evidence supports, and it is more interesting than the alternative. Number 16. The colonial erasure, how it was done and why. The legal declaration of terra nullius in 1788 was not the only mechanism of erasure, it was the foundation, but the structure built on it was elaborate and comprehensive, and understanding how it worked is necessary for understanding why the story of this civilization is not already common knowledge. The first mechanism was physical. In the decades and centuries following British colonization, Aboriginal people were killed in enormous numbers. The exact figures are disputed, and in many cases the records are incomplete, but researchers who have studied the frontier violence of the colonial period estimate that between 100,000 and several 100,000 Aboriginal people were killed in the period between 1788 and the early 20th century through a combination of direct massacre, introduced disease, dispossession from land and water sources, and the deliberate destruction of the food systems that had sustained communities for tens of thousands of years. Communities that were wiped out took their knowledge with them. Languages that were the carriers of that knowledge fell silent. Ceremonial practices that encoded that knowledge in transmissible form were disrupted and in some cases permanently lost. This is not incidental to the question of the evidence. It is central to it. An unknown proportion of the knowledge that this civilization had accumulated over 65,000 years was destroyed in the colonial period, not preserved in archives, not transferred to other carriers, simply lost. We do not know how much. We cannot know how much. We can only know that the destruction was substantial and deliberate, and that the knowledge systems that survived did so in spite of extraordinary efforts to eliminate them. The second mechanism was intellectual. The emerging discipline of archaeology in the 19th and early 20th centuries operated within the framework of cultural evolution that placed European civilization at the top of a developmental hierarchy and indigenous civilizations at various lower positions. This framework was not merely descriptive, it was prescriptive. It determined what archaeologists looked for, what they recognized when they found it, and how they described what they found. Sites that would have been recognized as evidence of complex settlement in a European context were described as temporary camps in an Australian context. Stone arrangements that would have been analysed for astronomical alignments in a European context were catalogued as random formations in an Australian context. The framework filtered what the evidence was allowed to mean. The third mechanism was legal. The land rights framework that governed Australia for most of its post-colonial history did not recognise continuous use and occupancy of specific territories as the basis for any legal claim to those territories. Without land rights, communities could be forcibly moved away from the sites that held their knowledge, their ceremonial obligations, and their intergenerational memory. And they were. The removal of Aboriginal communities from their traditional territories, often under policies explicitly designed to break the transmission of traditional knowledge and culture, continued well into the 20th century. The stolen generations. The term refers to the systematic policy of removing Aboriginal children from their families and communities, beginning in the 19th century and continuing in formal policy until 1969, and in practice beyond that. The children were placed in institutions or with non-Aboriginal families and were actively prevented from speaking their languages, practicing their culture, or maintaining contact with the knowledge systems that their communities had developed over tens of thousands of years. The intent was explicit in many of the policy documents that drove it to eliminate Aboriginal culture by preventing its transmission to the next generation. This was not prehistory, it was last century. Some of the people who were taken are still alive. Understanding the erasure is not separate from understanding what was erased. You cannot separate the question of what this civilization built and knew and preserved from the question of what was deliberately taken from it, because the taking shapes what we can now find and what has been permanently lost. The archaeological evidence that survives does so partly by accident and partly because of the extraordinary resilience of the communities that maintained it in the face of a 200-year campaign to eliminate it. The knowledge that survives deserves to be understood in that context. Number 17, the suppressed excavations and the findings that disappeared. Not every difficult finding in Australian archaeology was suppressed in the sense of being actively hidden or destroyed, but a significant number of findings were, and the pattern of what happened to them is worth documenting. The most significant category involves skeletal remains. Over the course of the colonial period and into the 20th century, an enormous number of Aboriginal skeletal remains were collected from burial sites across Australia and sent to institutions in Britain, Europe, and the United States. The British Museum, the Natural History Museum in London, the Smithsonian Institution in the United States, universities across Europe. The collections were assembled as specimens for racial science, for the study of human physical variation, for the purposes of a scientific paradigm that is now recognized as morally bankrupt and methodologically compromised. The remains were taken without consent, often in violation of the explicit wishes of communities, and in many cases from burial sites that were actively sacred to the people whose ancestors lay in them. The significance for this story is not only ethical, though the ethical dimension is substantial. The significance is that when skeletal remains are in institutions rather than in the ground, they are not available for the kind of systematic archaeological and genetic analysis that has transformed our understanding of Australian prehistory in the past 20 years. The remains that Jim Bowler found at Lake Mungo in 1969 were in the ground. They could be studied, they produced the dates that opened the timeline. But how many other deposits of comparable or greater antiquity exist in collections that are inaccessible to the researchers who could date them, analyze them, and add their information to the record? We do not know. That is the point. Then there is the matter of specific sites that were excavated, and the results of which never reach publication, or reach publication in forms that were so hedged and qualified that the significance of the findings was invisible to anyone who was not already looking for them. Archaeology is an academic discipline with all of the institutional pressures of academic disciplines. Pressure to publish findings that fit within current frameworks, and to bury or minimize findings that do not. A site that produces unexpected dates does not get written up with the same enthusiasm as a site that confirms existing timelines. A finding that implies complex settlement in a region where complex settlement was not expected requires more explanation, more qualification, more political navigation within the field than a finding that confirms what was already believed. This is not unique to Australian archaeology. It is a feature of how any established scientific field relates to findings that challenge its foundational assumptions. But in Australian archaeology, where the foundational assumptions were shaped by the colonial framework that declared the continent had no civilization, the effect has been particularly pronounced. There have been specific cases of research being formally suppressed, cases where Aboriginal communities, having been consulted about research on their traditional sites, requested that findings not be published because the publication would compromise sacred or sensitive information. This is a legitimate form of suppression, requested by the communities whose heritage is at stake, and it should be distinguished clearly from the institutional suppression that happens when inconvenient findings are quietly shelved. But the effect on the public record is similar. Information that exists is not accessible. The full picture of what is known by researchers, by community members, by knowledge holders who have not shared their knowledge with the academic record is almost certainly larger than what is in the published literature. By how much, it is impossible to say. What is possible to say is that the published literature, incomplete as it is, already contains enough to fundamentally revise the story of human civilization as most people understand it. The full picture would revise it further still. Number 18. Why mainstream archaeology is 50 years behind. In 2019, an article published in the journal Nature outlined a simple timeline of firsts in Australian prehistoric archaeology. First cremation, first ground edge axes, first astronomical alignments, first complex aquaculture infrastructure, first evidence of organised long-distance trade in the Southern Hemisphere. Every item on the list was definitively Australian. Every item on the list predated the equivalent claim first from every other part of the world. The article received moderate academic attention and essentially no mainstream coverage. Compare that to the attention given to, for example, a new analysis of Stonehenge, or a new theory about the construction of the pyramids, or a revised dating of a Mesopotamian site. These stories reliably generate substantial media coverage, popular books, documentary series, museum exhibitions. They circulate in the cultural conversation about ancient history in a way that the Australian archaeological record almost never does. Why? Part of the answer is geographical and cultural. The institutions that dominate global archaeology, the universities, the museums, the journals, the funding bodies, are overwhelmingly located in the Northern Hemisphere and are predominantly Western. The ancient world that they have built their frameworks around, the world that begins in Mesopotamia and Egypt and the Mediterranean, and eventually becomes the history of Western civilization, is the world they have the most institutional investment in, the most professional expertise in, the most cultural familiarity with. Australian archaeology sits outside that network in a way that Greek archaeology or Egyptian archaeology never has. Part of the answer is the ongoing influence of the colonial framework. Even in the absence of explicit bias, the mental categories that shape what researchers look for and how they interpret what they find are shaped by assumptions that were built in a specific historical context. The assumption that settled civilization is a recent development in human history. The assumption that complexity requires specific material markers like metals and writing. The assumption that landscapes without obvious monumental architecture are landscapes without complex societies. These assumptions filter the evidence in Australian archaeology in the same way they always have, just more subtly than before. But part of the answer is more specific to the past 50 years, and it involves a genuine and honourable form of caution. As Australian archaeology has begun to confront the scale of what the evidence shows, as the findings have become more difficult to reconcile with the old framework, many researchers have become more careful rather than less, more hedged rather than bolder, more likely to qualify findings in ways that protect them from the kind of dismissal that new and provocative claims in any scientific field are vulnerable to. The caution is understandable. The cost of it is that the public communication of what the field actually knows has been systematically understated. There is a version of the Australian archaeological record that is now defensible, backed by multiple independent lines of evidence, robust enough to withstand serious scrutiny, that describes the civilization that existed here as the oldest, the most persistent, and in several specific respects, the most technically accomplished ancient civilization on the planet. That version is not being told, not because it is not supported by the evidence, but because the institutions that would need to tell it have not yet fully made the shift that the evidence demands. The shift is coming. It has been coming for decades, one careful paper at a time, but it has not yet reached the public conversation in the form that it deserves. And the lag between what the evidence shows and what most people have been told is, at this point, approximately 50 years. Number 19, what the elders have always said. In every community across the continent, there are people who have been saying this for a very long time. The elders who carry the songlines, the knowledge holders who know sections of astronomical tradition that have not been published in any academic paper, the custodians of ceremonial practices that encode information about the landscape going back further than any carbon date has yet confirmed, the grandmothers who know which plants are edible and which are medicinal, and how to prepare each one and what the seasonal cycles of each look like, and how the knowledge was passed to them by the grandmothers before them in a chain that goes back past any date that anyone has been willing to put in print. They have not been waiting for archaeology to confirm what they know. They have not needed the nature paper, or the genetic study, or the UNESCO listing, or the revised dating of the Majid baby shelter to know that they are the oldest continuous civilization on Earth. They have known it because it has been transmitted to them with precision and care by every generation before them, using systems built specifically to ensure that transmission survived everything that could threaten it. Some of them are willing to talk to researchers, some are not. The decision is complex, and the reasons for caution are not hard to understand. The history of Aboriginal knowledge being extracted by non-Aboriginal researchers, published in academic context without appropriate attribution or consent, monetized in ways that benefit the researcher but not the community, deployed in land rights hearings in ways that communities did not authorize, is long and detailed and well documented. The caution is earned. But in community after community, in the careful collaborative work that has been the only ethical model for research in this space for the past 2 or 3 decades, knowledge holders have shared enough for the researchers they work with to understand the scale of what is there. The astronomical knowledge, the archaeological knowledge, the geological knowledge, including knowledge of resources and landscape features whose existence was not confirmed by Western geology until decades after it had been described in traditional knowledge. The medical knowledge, the knowledge of water, where it is, how it moves, how to find it, how to manage it in a landscape where its absence is lethal. The depth of this knowledge is not a historical curiosity. It is not something that was relevant before colonization and has now been superseded by more efficient systems. It is living knowledge held by living people, still accurate, still applicable, still in some cases describing phenomena and processes that Western science has not fully characterized. There is a practice among some Arrernte knowledge holders in Central Australia of describing the geological history of specific landscapes in narrative form, stories that encode information about volcanic events, changes in drainage patterns, ancient lake formations, that have been confirmed by geological survey as accurate descriptions of events that happened tens of thousands of years ago. The events are not remembered because someone was there to see them and wrote them down. They are remembered because the oral tradition that encoded them was built to last, maintained with the precision of a system that understood what it would mean to lose the information. And they have been saying all of this to anyone who would listen for 200 years. That is the hardest part of this story to sit with. Not the age of the civilization, not the sophistication of what was built here. The hardest part is that none of this was unknown. The knowledge holders knew. They have always known. The knowledge was there to be acknowledged, to be studied in collaboration, to be incorporated into the story of humanity in the proportions the evidence demands. And for 200 years, the institutions that had the power to do that chose not to, chose the framework over the evidence, chose the comfort of the timeline they had built over the inconvenience of the one that was actually there. The choosing is ending. Slowly and unevenly, and not without ongoing resistance, but it is ending. And the civilization that existed here for 65,000 years, that built the world's oldest aquaculture system, and the world's oldest axes, and the world's most ancient astronomical traditions, and the world's longest running information system, is being seen. It took a while, it is overdue, but here it is, number 20. The question that changes everything. Here is the question that has been underneath all of this. If the oldest continuous civilization on Earth spent 65,000 years developing an intimate, sophisticated, ecologically productive relationship with the continent it inhabited, if it built infrastructure that is still visible, encoded knowledge that is still accessible, maintained astronomical traditions that are still accurate, managed a landscape so effectively that the management is still measurable in the ecological record, if every line of evidence, the archaeology, the genetics, the linguistics, the ecological history, points to a civilization of extraordinary age and sophistication, sophistication. And if this has been progressively confirmed by decades of research from multiple independent disciplines, then why is it not common knowledge? Why did most people grow up learning about Egypt and Rome and Mesopotamia and virtually nothing about the oldest civilization on the planet? That question is not rhetorical. It has an answer, and the answer has parts. The first part is the colonial framework. It has been discussed throughout this story, and its role is foundational. A framework that declared the continent empty at the point of contact, created conditions in which the evidence of what was there could not be acknowledged without also acknowledging the scale of what had been done. And the scale of what had been done was enormous. The land was taken, the people were killed, dispossessed, and subjected to a systematic campaign of cultural destruction that lasted 2 centuries. Acknowledging the civilization that existed before that campaign began is simultaneously acknowledging the full moral weight of destroying it. The reluctance to do the first is not unrelated to the reluctance to face the second. The second part is the institutional inertia of established disciplines. Archaeology, history, and the humanities built their frameworks around a set of assumptions about where and when and how civilization emerged. Those frameworks have enormous amounts of professional reputation, institutional infrastructure, and cultural capital invested in them. Revising them is not just a matter of updating the textbooks. It requires a reconstitution of the foundational narrative of human history that affects every institution, from universities to museums to school curricula. That is a slow process under any circumstances. Under the additional pressure of the colonial legacy, it has been slower still. The third part is more recent and more correctable. The research that established the full scope of this civilization, the dating techniques that pushed the timeline to 65,000 years and beyond, the genetic studies that confirmed the antiquity of the Aboriginal Australian lineage, the systematic documentation of the Songlines and the astronomical traditions, and the ecological management record. Much of this work has been done in the past 30 years. The findings are in the academic literature. They have been published and peer-reviewed and replicated and extended. They have not yet made the transition to the popular history of human civilization in the way that their significance demands. That transition is overdue, and it is happening, but it is happening more slowly than the evidence warrants. And the fourth part is simply this. The story was not told to most people because most people were not told it. The information exists. The evidence is there. The researchers have done the work. The knowledge holders have shared what they were willing to share. The gap is not in the research. The gap is in the telling. And the telling is something that can be changed. You are listening to this story right now, and you will tell someone else about it, or you will not. If you do, the story moves. If enough people tell it, it becomes the version of human history that people grow up knowing. The version that starts not with Greece or Rome or Mesopotamia, but with the oldest continent and the oldest people, and 65,000 years of extraordinary human achievement that was never supposed to reach you. It did. That is not nothing. That is in fact the way things change. Take a breath. You are still here, which means something in this story held you. I think I know what it was. It was the scale. The 65,000 years is the number that does not let go once you have really heard it. It is the number that makes the rest of the story not just interesting, but necessary. Because if that number is true, and it is, and if the implications of that number have not yet been incorporated into the story we tell about human civilization, then we are all carrying an incomplete map. And an incomplete map is a map that can get you lost. This civilization did not get lost. It survived. Against everything that was thrown at it over 2 centuries of deliberate erasure, it survived. The knowledge is still here. The people who carry it are still here. The stone walls at Budj Bim are still standing in the Victorian countryside. The Guion paintings are still on the rock in the Kimberley. The songlines are still being walked. The dark constellations are still being read. The astronomical alignments at Wadi Yowang still point exactly where they were designed to point, at the setting sun on the longest day of the year, as they have done for thousands of years. The evidence was always here. We just had to be willing to look. Drop a comment and tell me. Where are you watching this from? And if this is the first time you've heard this story, tell me that too, because I want to know how far this is traveling. The story has been waiting a long time to travel. It deserves to go far. Number 21. The stone circles of Western Australia and what they measure. Before we close the full account of this civilization, there is one more category of evidence that deserves its own chapter. Not because it is the most dramatic, though some of it is, but because it comes from a region that is less frequently discussed in popular treatments of Australian prehistory. And because what has been found there adds a dimension to the picture that the eastern seaboard sites do not fully provide. The Pilbara region of northwest and Western Australia is one of the oldest exposed geological surfaces on the planet. The rocks there are some of the most ancient accessible on Earth. And across that ancient landscape, there are stone arrangements. Hundreds of them. Circles, lines, alignments, scattered across the ranges and the plains and distributions that do not resemble the kind of random patterns that natural processes produce. Some of these arrangements have been studied. The results of those studies have, in most cases, been submitted for publication in academic journals where they sit alongside other findings of comparable significance and receive comparable amounts of attention, which is to say, not much. What the studies have found is consistent with what has been found elsewhere on the continent. Astronomical alignments, solstice and equinox markers, star alignments, structures positioned to frame specific astronomical events from specific viewing points. The same pattern of intentional, precise, sky-connected architecture that appears at Wurruyuang in Victoria, that appears in the oral traditions encoded in the Songlines, that appears in the astronomical vocabulary of Aboriginal languages across the continent. But the Pilbara sites add something, because the rock surface in the Pilbara is one of the most datable surfaces in Australia. The desert varnish that develops on exposed rock surfaces in arid conditions accumulates at a known rate, and its thickness can be used to estimate how long a surface has been exposed. The stones in some of the Pilbara arrangements show desert varnish profiles suggesting they have been in their current positions for very long periods. Some of the estimates that have been produced for specific arrangements are not centuries, they are millennia. The Pilbara is also the location of some of the world's most dense concentrations of rock engravings, petroglyphs, images carved into rock surfaces using stone tools, covering thousands of square kilometers of the landscape. The images include animals, human figures, geometric forms, and arrangements of marks whose interpretation remains actively debated. Some of the pecked images show animals that are now extinct in Australia, species that disappeared from the landscape more than 5,000 years ago, which gives a minimum age for those specific images. An art tradition rich enough, continuous enough, and ancient enough to have recorded extinct species in their living form. An astronomical tradition precise enough to have aligned stone structures to the solstice thousands of years before any comparable structure in the Western world. A knowledge system durable enough to have preserved accurate geographical information about drowned coastlines through 12,000 years of language transmission. This is the Pilbara, and the Pilbara is one region among many. Every region of the continent has its equivalent body of evidence, its particular contribution to the full picture of the civilization that existed here. The full picture is large, it is still being assembled. New sites are found every year. New analyses of existing material produce new findings. New collaborations between researchers and knowledge holders reveal new dimensions of the knowledge that was encoded in oral tradition and ceremony, and has not yet been fully documented by the academic record. The assembly is ongoing. The picture it is assembling is the picture of the oldest continuous civilization on Earth, doing extraordinary things for an extraordinary length of time, in a place that most of the world was told was empty. It was not empty, it was full. It was overflowing with exactly the kind of human achievement that we are supposed to recognize and honor and learn from. And now you know. Number 22, the sea level rise memory and the oldest stories on Earth. There is a category of Aboriginal oral tradition that has attracted serious scientific attention in the past decade from an unexpected direction. Geologists and oceanographers. Researchers studying the records of sea level change around the Australian coast have known for a long time that the coastline of Australia looked very different during the last ice age. When global sea levels were significantly lower, the Australian landmass was much larger than it is today. What are now shallow continental shelves and shallow sea areas were dry land. The coastline was anywhere from 50 to 150 kilometers further out from the current shore in many areas. Islands that are now separated from the mainland by water were connected to it. River systems that now drain into the sea cross the coastal plains and reach much further west and north before ending. When the Ice Age ended, roughly 12,000 years ago, the ice sheets melted and the sea level rose. It rose relatively quickly, over a period of several thousand years, advancing inland as it rose, flooding the coastal plains, drowning the river valleys, pushing the shoreline back to approximately its current position. Communities that had been living on the coastal plains had to relocate inland as the water advanced. This is a catastrophic event by any standard. The flooding of populated land, the loss of coastal territories, the forced migration of communities inward, and communities that experienced it would be expected to remember it. They do. Researchers analysing Aboriginal oral traditions from coastal communities around Australia have found accounts that describe a time when the sea was much further away, when the land extended beyond the current shoreline, when specific features that are now underwater were above water and accessible. The descriptions are specific. They name specific locations. They describe specific geographical features. And when researchers map those descriptions against the reconstructed Ice Age coastline based on seafloor bathymetry, the correspondences are precise. Specific oral traditions from communities on the South Australian coast describe islands and coastal features that the seafloor mapping confirms existed at the positions described and that were drowned by sea level rise somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 years ago. The traditions have been transmitted accurately for somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 years. Specific traditions from communities in Western Victoria describe a time when the sea was not visible from places where it is now clearly visible, and other traditions from the same region describe the flooding of low-lying land in ways consistent with the progressive sea level rise documented in the geological record for that area. The researchers who have published on this, linguists and geologists and oceanographers working together on the same body of evidence, have reached a careful but significant conclusion. Some of these oral traditions appear to be genuine cultural memories of real geographic events that occurred at the end of the last ice age, preserved accurately through oral transmission for at least 10,000 years and possibly longer. 10,000 years of accurate geological memory in oral tradition. There is no other example of this on Earth. But wait, think about what that means for the rest of the oral tradition. If the stories about the sea are accurate, geologically verifiable records of real events from 10,000 years ago, then what about the other stories? The stories about volcanic eruptions, the stories about landscape transformations, the stories about the behavior of now extinct animals, the stories about the filling and drying of lake systems. All of the archaeological and geographical and geological information encoded in the songlines, and the ceremonial traditions and the oral histories. If the sea level stories are accurate after 10,000 years, why would any of the rest be less so? The answer is that there is no particular reason to assume they are less accurate. The transmission system that kept the sea level memories intact for 10,000 years was the same transmission system that kept everything else. The songlines, the ceremony, the careful intergenerational, institutionally supported practice of transmitting knowledge with precision, because precision is survival and imprecision is death in a landscape that does not forgive navigational or ecological error. The civilization that built that transmission system understood something about long-term information storage that modern civilization, with all of its hardware and software and redundancy systems and server farms, is still struggling to achieve. How to keep specific, accurate information intact and accessible across spans of time that exceed the lifetime of any technology, any institution, any empire. They solved it 65,000 years ago, give or take, on the oldest continent on Earth, and the solution is still running. Number 23, the Denisovan inheritance and what it means for human history. In 2010, a small bone fragment from the finger of a child was recovered from a cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. The cave was called Denisovan. The bone was so well preserved that DNA could be extracted from it. The DNA, when analyzed, turned out to belong to a type of human that science had not previously known existed. Not a Neanderthal, not a modern human. Something else. A third type of archaic human, living in Siberia tens of thousands of years ago, genetically distinct from both the Neanderthals and the modern humans that were contemporaneous with them. The Denisovans, as they came to be called. The discovery of the Denisovans was one of the significant events in paleoanthropology of the past 20 years. But what is less commonly discussed in general coverage of the Denisovan discovery is the population that shows the highest level of Denisovan genetic heritage among any living humans today. It is not the populations of Siberia, which is where the Denisovans appear to have lived. It is not the populations of Central Asia or China or anywhere in the general geographic vicinity of the Altai Mountains. The population that shows the highest concentration of Denisovan genetic inheritance anywhere in the modern world is Aboriginal Australians, and Papuan populations from New Guinea, which is closely related to Aboriginal Australian ancestry. But in Australia specifically, the Denisovan genetic signal is striking. Researchers have estimated that Aboriginal Australians carry somewhere between 3 and 6% of their genome from Denisovan ancestors, a figure substantially higher than is found in any Eurasian population. This finding requires an explanation. The Denisovans appear, from the archaeological and genetic record, to have been primarily an Asian population. How did they contribute so significantly to the ancestry of the people who eventually reached Australia? The answer is that the migration route taken by the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians passed through Southeast Asia and the island chains of what is now the Indonesian archipelago, at a time when those areas appear to have had Denisovan populations. The meeting happened somewhere in that region before the crossing to Australia, and the genetic contribution of that meeting was then carried south and east and ultimately across the water gap into Australia. This matters for several reasons. First, it is evidence of the deep antiquity of the Aboriginal Australian lineage. You only accumulate that level of Denisovan ancestry if your population separated from the rest of the out of Africa migration very early and took a route that brought it into extended contact with Denisovan populations. The timing implied by the genetic signal is consistent with a departure from the common ancestral population somewhere between 60 and 80,000 years ago. Second, and this is where it gets interesting in ways that are still being explored, it is possible that the Denisovan genetic contribution carried with it specific adaptive advantages for the Australian environment. Some researchers have speculated that Denisovan ancestry may have contributed immune system variants, metabolic adaptations, or other biological capacities that were beneficial in the specific environments of Southeast Asia and Australia. The hypothesis is still being investigated, but the idea that the oldest human civilization on Earth may have acquired some of its biological toolkit from an entirely separate branch of the human family is not a fringe speculation. It is a serious scientific hypothesis with genetic evidence behind it. Third, the Denisovan inheritance places Aboriginal Australians at a unique intersection in the human family tree. They are the direct descendants of the first modern humans to leave Africa and reach Australia. They carry the genetic legacy of at least one archaic human species in their genomes. They have been present on the same continent for longer than any other human population anywhere on Earth. They are, in the most literal biological sense, the deepest human lineage currently living, and they have been described in the framework that shaped 2 centuries of Australian policy and scholarship as primitive, as undeveloped, as the bottom rung of a developmental ladder that placed European civilization at the top. There is no kind way to say how wrong that framework was. Wrong empirically, wrong ethically, wrong in ways that caused and continue to cause real harm to real people. And the genetic record, which does not care about frameworks and does not negotiate with colonial history, has been among the most consistent and most comprehensive sources of evidence for exactly how wrong it was. Number 24, the living civilization, what remains and what is being reclaimed. This is not a story about something that is over. That distinction matters, and it is worth making explicitly, because the framing that treats this civilization as a thing of the past, as a collection of archaeological sites and genetic data and oral traditions preserved in amber, misses the most important dimension of what is actually happening. The civilization that has existed in Australia for 65,000 years is still here. The people who carry its knowledge are still here. The songlines are still being walked. The astronomical traditions are still being maintained. The fire management practices are being revived deliberately, methodically, in collaboration between Aboriginal communities and conservation organisations, and government agencies across the continent, because the evidence that those practices are necessary for the health of the Australian landscape is now undeniable. The revival of cultural burning is perhaps the most visible example of what is happening. Across southeastern Australia, in the wake of the catastrophic 2019 to 2020 season, Aboriginal communities and the fire management practitioners they train are conducting burns in landscapes that have not been managed by traditional practices for generations. The results, measured by ecologists and soil scientists and biodiversity researchers, are consistent with what the traditional knowledge predicted. Lower fuel loads, more diverse vegetation structure, faster return of native species, more resilient landscapes that are less vulnerable to catastrophic fire when dry conditions arrive. The knowledge works, not as a historical curiosity or a cultural practice maintained for its own sake, but as a functional land management system that produces measurable ecological outcomes. The 65,000-year investment in understanding how Australian landscapes respond to fire is paying dividends that are visible to any ecologist who is paying attention. The revival of language is another dimension of the ongoing story. Dozens of Aboriginal languages that were on the edge of extinction, with only a handful of elderly speakers remaining, are being actively revitalized in community-led programs that combine the work of the surviving speakers with linguistic documentation, educational resources, and community learning initiatives. Children who would a generation ago have grown up speaking only English are growing up speaking their ancestral languages. And with the language comes the knowledge encoded in it. The astronomical vocabulary, the landscape vocabulary, the ecological and ceremonial and navigational knowledge that was always carried in those words. The land rights movements of the past 50 years have returned significant portions of the Australian continent to the formal custodianship of the communities whose ancestors shaped them. And with legal recognition of custodianship comes the practical ability to manage those landscapes according to traditional knowledge, rather than the replacement land management systems that have been degrading them since colonisation. None of this is happening fast enough. The language revitalization programs cannot always work quickly enough to capture the full knowledge of the oldest remaining speakers before that knowledge is gone. The fire management revival is underfunded and under-resourced relative to the scale of the challenge. The land rights framework, while it has achieved significant things, still leaves large portions of the traditional territories of many communities under tenure arrangements that prevent the full expression of traditional management responsibilities. The harms of the colonial period are not undone by the current period of partial reparation, but something is being reclaimed, something that was almost lost is coming back, and the civilization that survived 65,000 years of dramatic climate change, multiple glacial cycles, the transformation of vast landscapes from tropical wetland to arid desert, survived also 2 centuries of deliberate erasure, and is now in the process of reasserting its presence in the story of its own country, on its own terms, with its knowledge intact enough to be applied, and its people determined enough to apply it. That is not a small thing. That is, in the context of what this civilization has endured and what it has preserved. Exactly the kind of thing you would expect from the oldest continuous civilization on Earth. Number 25. The question the timeline changes. Let us end with the question that has been building since the beginning of this story. If we accept the full weight of the evidence, and we should, because it is substantial and robust and has been built across decades of research by serious people using the best methods available to them, then the history of human civilization has to be rewritten, not revised. Rewritten. The story of human civilization as it is currently told in textbooks, in museums, in popular history, in the cultural narratives that most people in the Western world carry inside them. As the basic framework for understanding who humans are and what they have done, that story begins in the wrong place. It begins approximately 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia and Egypt, and builds forward from there. It treats the 12,000 years since the agricultural revolution as the whole of the meaningful human story, and everything before it as prelude. But the human story, the full human story, begins 65,000 years ago on the oldest continent on Earth. And the civilization that began there is not the prelude to something that happened later elsewhere. It is the story. It is the main event. It is the longest, most persistent, most ecologically sophisticated expression of human intelligence and organization that has ever existed. And it has been running continuously, without collapse, without interruption, without replacement by a conquering civilization from its beginning until today. Every other civilization in the world, every empire and republican kingdom that Western history has taught us to regard as the great achievements of humanity is a recent development when measured against the timescale of what existed here. Rome is recent, Greece is recent, Egypt is recent. The oldest cities of Mesopotamia are recent. Everything that we learn to call ancient is, from the perspective of the civilization we have been discussing tonight, practically contemporary. That realization changes something. It should change something. It changes the question from where did civilization begin to where did it begin, and how old is the oldest one? And what does that tell us about what humans are capable of and what forms intelligence and organization can take across 65,000 years of sustained development? The answer to that question is not fully known yet. It is being built piece by piece in the archives of Aboriginal knowledge that are still being documented, in the archaeological sites still being excavated, in the genetic studies still being conducted, in the collaborative research between communities and scientists that is finally, slowly operating with the mutual respect that evidence has always demanded. The full answer will take time, but the direction of the answer is clear. The oldest continuous civilization on Earth is here. It was always here. It built extraordinary things and knew extraordinary things and preserved extraordinary things across a length of time that makes every other claim about the antiquity of human achievement look modest. And it was nearly erased. And it was not. That is the most important sentence in this entire story. The civilization that existed here for 65,000 years was nearly erased by 2 centuries of deliberate colonial destruction. And it was not. It survived. It endured. The knowledge is still here. The people who carry it are still here. And now, slowly and with increasing momentum, the rest of the world is finally being told the truth about what was here all along. Close your eyes if you want to. Let the numbers settle. 65,000 years, the oldest axes, the oldest cremation, the oldest aquaculture, the oldest astronomical alignments, the oldest oral traditions, the oldest genomic lineage of any living human population, the oldest civilization on Earth. It was never lost. We were just not looking. Outro. That is the story of what was here before the pyramids. Before the pharaohs, before Mesopotamia, before everything we were told came first. There is a great deal more. There are aspects of this civilization, specific sites, specific bodies of knowledge, specific research findings, specific chapters of the history of how it was suppressed and how it has survived that could fill many more hours and many more stories. What we have covered tonight is the outline of the picture. The full picture is still being assembled, and it is already more extraordinary than anything I could fit into a single sitting. If this story has moved you, if you found yourself holding any part of it with more care than you expected, I would ask you to do one thing. Tell someone. Tell them that the oldest continuous civilization on Earth is in Australia. Tell them about Lake Mungo and Budj Bim and the Songlines and the dark constellations and the sea level memories. Tell them that the timeline we were given was incomplete and that the complete version is not smaller but larger, not less interesting but vastly more. The story deserves to travel. It has been waiting a long time for the chance. If you have been here to the end of this, thank you. Drop a comment, tell me where you're watching from, and tell me which chapter stopped you. I will see you in the next one. Interlude: the megafauna and the memory of giants. There is a category of knowledge that has been sitting at the intersection of paleontology and oral tradition for a long time without receiving the attention it deserves. It concerns animals that no longer exist. Australia, at the time of human arrival 65,000 years ago, was populated by a remarkable collection of large animals. Megafauna, in the technical language, species above 40 kilograms in body mass. Diprotodon, a wombat-like creature the size of a large hippopotamus. Procoptodon, a giant short-faced kangaroo standing nearly 2 meters at the shoulder. Thylacoleo carnifex, the marsupial lion. Genyonis newtoni, a huge flightless bird. Quinquina, a terrestrial crocodile. Megalania, a monitor lizard reaching estimates of 5 to 7 meters in length. The largest land reptile known from the Cenozoic era. Most of these species were extinct by approximately 46,000 years ago. Some may have persisted longer in refugia, isolated populations in areas where human density remained low. The cause of their extinction is debated, but the most widely accepted current view among researchers is that a combination of human hunting pressure and habitat change from fire management drove the megafaunal extinctions in Australia, with human impact being the more significant factor in most cases. The timing means that the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians lived alongside these animals. Not as tourists observing them from a distance, as hunters and competitors, as neighbours in the landscape, as the cause of the population pressure that ultimately drove many of them to extinction over the first 10,000 to 15,000 years of human presence in Australia, and they remembered them. Across multiple Aboriginal language traditions, there are oral accounts of creatures that do not correspond to any animal currently living in Australia, but that correspond with varying degrees of precision to megafauna species known from the fossil record. The bunyip, the large water-dwelling creature described in traditions from across southeastern Australia, has been analysed by some researchers in the context of megafaunal animals that inhabited the lake and river systems of the continent. The descriptions of some bunyip accounts, the size, the behaviour, the habitat, the specific physical features mentioned, correspond more closely to Diprotodon or similar large extinct marsupials than to anything currently living in Australian waterways. The Katamakara, creatures described in the traditions of the Diari people of South Australia, as enormous beings that lived in ancient times and fed on the tops of tall trees before they were killed and their bones left in the earth, have been compared to the fossil record of giant marsupials from the Lake Eyre Basin, where Diprotodon and other megafauna remains have been found in sediment deposits consistent with the geographical locations described in the traditions. These are not definitive equivalences. The traditions have been modified by generations of retelling in ways that have added interpretive layers. The researchers who have made these comparisons are careful to note that correlation is not proof of memory. But the correlation is there, and given what we now know about the accuracy of Aboriginal oral traditions in preserving geological and geographical information across timescales of 10,000 years and beyond, the hypothesis that these traditions preserve memory of actual encounters with megafaunal species that have been extinct for tens of thousands of years is not as easily dismissed as it once was. Memory of giants, accurate enough to be recognizable across 46,000 years of linguistic and cultural evolution. If that is what these traditions are, they are the longest running biological records in the history of any civilization anywhere on Earth. Interlude: the medicine that Western science is still catching up to. There is a dimension of Aboriginal Australian knowledge that is only now beginning to be systematically studied by Western science, and the early results of that study are producing reactions that range from surprised to astonished, depending on how much the researcher knew before they started looking. Aboriginal Australian communities across the continent developed over 65,000 years of practice, extensive systems of medical knowledge. Plant medicines, wound treatments, methods of managing infections, reducing fevers, treating injuries, managing pain. The knowledge was not static. It was updated, refined, tested empirically over generations in exactly the same way that any empirical knowledge system is tested. Use it, observe the results, pass on what works, discard what does not, refine what shows partial effectiveness. 65,000 years of empirical pharmacology. That is what it amounts to. Researchers studying Australian Aboriginal plant medicines have found, with a consistency that has now been documented across multiple independent studies, that plants used in traditional medical practice contain bioactive compounds that are pharmacologically consistent with the uses described in traditional knowledge. Plants used for wound treatment contain antibacterial compounds. Plants used for fever reduction contain antipyretic compounds. Plants used for pain management contain analgesic compounds. Not always, not with perfect consistency. Traditional medical systems are never perfectly accurate because they were developed without the analytical tools to precisely characterize active compounds. But the hit rate, the proportion of traditional medicinal plants that contain bioactive compounds consistent with their described use, is substantially higher than chance would predict. One example that has received some research attention involves the use of specific eucalyptus species in traditional wound treatment. The antibacterial properties of eucalyptus oil are now well established in Western pharmacology. Eucalyptus oil is used in commercial antibacterial products in every pharmacy in the world. Aboriginal communities in specific regions of Australia were using preparations from eucalyptus species to treat wounds and prevent infection thousands of years before the first European pharmacologist characterized the compound responsible for its antibacterial activity. Another example involves plants used to treat eye infections in the arid zones. Specific plant species used in traditional treatment of eye conditions in the central desert communities have been found to contain compounds with antibiotic activity against the specific organisms responsible for the most common eye infections in arid environments. The traditional practitioners did not know about bacteria. They knew what worked. The result is the same. There are compounds in Australian plants that have been used in traditional medicine for thousands of years that have not been pharmacologically characterized by Western science. That is not a criticism of Western pharmacology. It is simply a statement about the scale of the unexplored resource. Australia has approximately 24,000 vascular plant species, most of them endemic, most of them with no pharmacological characterization in the Western literature. The traditional knowledge systems of Aboriginal communities have been working with a significant subset of those species for 65,000 years. The systematic pharmacological investigation of Australian traditional medicine is underfunded, understudied, and proceeding more slowly than the evidence of its potential warrants. The knowledge holders who carry the most detailed understanding of specific medicinal applications are aging, and in communities where the transmission of traditional knowledge was disrupted by the colonial period, that knowledge is at risk of being lost before it can be documented. This is not a theoretical concern, it is a practical one, with implications for medicine that extend well beyond Australia. The pharmacological library encoded in 65,000 years of empirical plant medicine practice is a resource of incalculable potential value, and significant portions of it are currently accessible only through the living knowledge of specific individuals in specific communities. It is also, and this matters, the intellectual property of those communities. The research frameworks that govern the study of traditional medicines in most jurisdictions now include provisions for benefit sharing and community consent, provisions that did not exist in earlier decades and whose absence allowed substantial extraction of traditional knowledge without compensation or acknowledgement. But the implementation of those provisions is uneven, and the history of extraction before they existed is not reversible. The knowledge is there. It is real, it is valuable, and the communities that hold it are, with increasing sophistication and increasing legal support, in a position to determine on their own terms what is shared, how, and with what acknowledgement and benefit flowing back to its origins. 65,000 years of pharmacological practice, the oldest medical library on Earth, encoded in living knowledge, still being maintained by the people whose ancestors built it. We have barely begun to listen to it, and already what we have heard is extraordinary.